If you're enjoying the Health Geeks Book Club podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, rating, or review, whichever your preferred podcatcher platform allows.
This episode is sponsored by Well Balanced Nutrition and 360 Health.
Welcome to the Health Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Well, good morning, Kristen. Here we are, the Health Geeks, meeting again and talking about our current reading.
Hey, everyone.
Yes. You know, I was thinking about why we read these books, and one of the things that I enjoy is I feel like I have time to have a personal conversation with the author, and I make notes in my books. I put little tags in there and have a reaction because they go slow enough in a book that you can do that, you know? I mean, you can take your time. Mm-hmm. But today, we have even more fun because we have the actual author of the book that we have read, Slaying the Food Myths, with us, the truth behind the headlines. And I'm going to let Kristen introduce Dr. Chaney.
Yes, today we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Steve Chaney. He is an award-winning professor who taught human metabolism and nutrition to medical students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 40 years. He is an internationally recognized scientist who has published over 100 research studies and reviews in peer-reviewed scientific journals.
And he's from North Carolina.
Uh-huh.
And he published this book in 2018. So this is a kind of current book, you know. This is 2022, right? Mm-hmm. So that's good.
Yeah. So welcome, Dr. Chaney. Thank you for being here.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I like to talk about the structure of the book, too, before we get started. It has a really good table of contents. It's very readable. It's written in language that our audience, if you don't have a strong science background, this book could help you understand some of those concepts. Has a terrific bibliography, very current citations, and it has a glossary for readers. So I love the fact that this book is structured with the reader in mind.
So, Dr. Chaney, you wrote Slaying the Supplement Myths and Slaying the Food Myths. As a professor at UNC, what inspired you to write these two books?
Well, I guess it actually started while I was still teaching because medical students, you know, we send them out as doctors, but they come in from all walks of life, all beliefs. And as I was teaching the medical students, I realized a lot of them were believing myths, things that were untrue, things that might actually harm their patients if they were to share that with them. Understood they didn't really understand the scientific method. And so that's what really got the idea started. And then, you know, once I retired, I could sometimes call it graduated after 40 years. It sort of felt that way. But once I retired, you know, and started speaking more broadly to the general public, again, the same sort of food myths came up. And I guess the analogy I could use, because everybody recognizes it, is the controversies we see in the political field nowadays. Mm-hmm. And
the fake news thing.
Not going to take any sides on this. It happens on both sides of the aisle. But these myths that keep getting perpetuated, and then they're amplified with social media, and you know, various so-called experts who simply take one point of view. So I think everybody recognizes that problem because it's so prominent in our discussion nowadays. But the same thing occurs in nutrition. So that's really where I wanted to get started.
Dr. Chaney, don't you think the ability to ask questions is kind of missing? People accept things and don't ask questions and say, well, you know, from my experience, that may or may not make sense. I think I need to ask into that. That's one of the things that I've seen. And you sort of said in your book that science and rational thought have gone out the window. I hope to reintroduce them into the discussion. And I love that.
Yes. So, and again, one of the points you made there is really important. Some of the things that you hear about nutrition, about what you should be eating, what you shouldn't be eating, which foods are healthy, so forth and so on. It's keto, paleo, vegan, what's best for you. Some of the things you hear really defy common sense. So we have to use common sense sometimes and ask ourselves, well, is this plausible? Is it true based on my experience? But the other thing is, yes, it's a whole science issue. And I think the thing is that people don't really understand the scientific method.
I agree 100%. You want to review that with us a little bit?
So, the reason of the scientific method is what makes it work is we are all skeptics.
Exactly.
Every time somebody designs a clinical study, they're often trying to test the existing paradigm. They're often trying to disprove it. And, that just strengthens the scientific method. And, here's the interesting thing. For being the 10th person to prove the paradigm is true, you get kudos for being the first person to prove it isn't true, or it might not be true. So this is where it really gets interesting. A good scientist recognizes that, like I say, every clinical study is designed to disprove the previous one, or a previous paradigm. But also every good scientist recognizes that there is no perfect clinical study. Every clinical study has its flaws. So what scientists look for is, where do the averages go? So if there are 20 clinical studies out there, what do the top 15 show? There are 5 that may be outliers, but you want 15 or 20 studies, and when the majority of them, not just majority by 51%, but a large majority of them are going one way, that's what we tend to say, well, this seems to be working. This seems to be a good paradigm, but we're always ready to accept the fact that it may not be true. Some future studies may come along that will disprove it. So that's what a good scientist does. But unfortunately, there are lots of people who don't understand that. And that's where the problem comes in.
Man, it's the idea that science changes, but you have to have an open mind to that idea and then think about the weight of the evidence that you talk about. Also, as you're looking at recommendations and these headlines that we see coming up, and we have even on television, there will be things that occur. And I believe there's one that Dr. Oz...
Dr. Oz.
Is very a celebrity endorsement of a scientific article from a medical doctor.
So here's one thing you mentioned in your book. Let's play that.
The actual green coffee bean extract, the people who were given a fake pill and they didn't know the difference. People who were taking green coffee bean extract lost 1 pound per week.
1 pound per week by doing nothing extra except taking the pill. So what's behind the magic? It's the ingredient.
Yeah. So, you hear that go, I want the pill, I don't want the work. But when you hear someone who has studied and gone through the rigors of, professional education, you might want to trust their opinion. And you had an explanation of why maybe that wasn't a good idea. Do you want to dive into that with us?
Well, we try and teach physicians the scientific method. But, there's so many other things they have to learn in medical school. It kind of gets shoved in the background. So, medical doctors aren't necessarily the best arbiters of what's true and what isn't true. Medical societies. Now, this is really interesting. There was a study that came out just a month or so ago, where they looked at recommendations by medical societies for procedures, for pharmaceutical approaches, for medical procedures. And they found out that, when they really analyzed it, 95% of them weren't backed by good science. Wow. This is medical societies, mind you. This is where the recommendations that your doctor may give you when you're visiting their office. So that was really sobering. And I think that illustrates the problem. And then, of course, you have I call them the medical gurus. They got podcasts, they've got websites, and they have a particular viewpoint. And they tend to cherry pick the articles that support their viewpoint and ignore the rest. And again, that's the antithesis of the scientific method, because you really should look at the weight of evidence.
But marketing, that's a great idea because it's sensational and it catches attention and people go, oh, that's news.
Right, and if Dr. Oz is backing this, and this is before everybody knew that.
Well, didn't he sit in front of Congress and make an apology or something to the FDA? What was that you said later came along? He recognized a mistake he'd made?
He did apologize, but before that, we just knew that he was a doctor and thought that we could trust him. Mm-hmm. And, there's also other doctors online that are endorsing things that are cherry-picked as well. So it's, we're like, oh, we can't trust a doctor now. Well, who do we trust? How do we become our own good scientists? And I think you have a lot of great, helpful info in your books to start to think more like a scientist.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I really, and I understand there are years of training in this. I'm not going to turn all of you into research scientists, but my idea was to give you enough information that you could start to look at the things that these headlines you're seeing, these blogs you're reading, and start to say, well, gee, that might not be true. Maybe that should be investigated further. And Dr. Google can be your friend or your enemy. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but if you go to reliable websites, so when I'm searching something on Google, because I use Google as just like everybody else, but when I'm searching something, I tend to go to the Mayo Clinic, the NIH, reputable websites like that, rather than Dr. Strangelove's blog.
Oh, when you talk about quality of evidence, you also, in the science discussion in your book, talk about, test tube experimentation, cell culture, animal studies, human trials, and then, moving findings from one of those levels to the human. You want to speak to that a little bit? Because I think when you ask the question, hey, that's a great headline, I'm going to look up the underpinnings or the article. One of the things you said to look for might be, is this relevant to human or is this relevant to the lab?
Yeah, so that's an important point. That's an important point to make, because that's one of the easiest things that you can do without a lot of training. Mm-hmm. And so my experience comes from, because my research was in cancer treatments, cancer drugs, and through the whole discovery process. So you start in a test tube. You have a particular enzyme or particular receptor in a cell surface. You think if we can inhibit that, we might be able to kill certain cancer cells. So you screen compounds to see if they work, and that's in a test tube. And okay, you might find 100 compounds. 1,000 compounds, whatever it is to work. You might choose the best 100 out of that. But then you go to next step up is usually cell culture, and you test them in cell culture, and maybe only 10% of them work. And that's because some of them aren't taken up by the cells. Some of them, as soon as they get in the cells, are metabolized to something else. Some, as fast as they get in the cells, they're just flushed back out again. So in a test tube, they look really good. But in cell culture, when you have a real human cell there, they don't work. Then typically you go to animal experiments. I'm not a big fan of that, but it is a necessary part because you don't want to be killing human beings by testing these drugs prematurely. So you go to animals. And what worked well in the cell, in the human cell, may not work in the animals. And again, now you've got the whole system going on. They may just go out in the urine. The liver may just destroy them right away. So a lot of things happen there, or they may turn out to be very toxic to normal cells. They didn't just kill the cancer cells; they killed the whole daggone animal, which is that sounds like, gee, that's terrible. You're doing that to animals, but I'd a whole lot rather do that to animals than to people. And then you go to the clinical trials. So the ones that actually survive those first 3 levels, you go to clinical trials. And again, maybe 1 out of 10 works and actually makes it into the it makes it into a useful therapeutic. The
Right.
same is true when you're looking at nutritional studies.
Yeah, we have a lot of studies that are just still in animals alone, and you said only 1 in 10 of those might actually be true for human bodies.
Yeah, and as we've
That's
been
right.
reading these other books, we are looking at that when people give us an example and they say it's in an animal study, and then they go on and say, so you should do this too. Kristen and I kind of stop there and say, oh,
Maybe not.
let's just make sure we understand that was an animal study and not a human clinical trial.
Right.
Randomized.
Well, speaking of nutrition, you debunk or explain the top 10 nutrition myths in your book. What made you choose these myths out of curiosity?
Well, these are ones that I would hear the most often.
Okay.
So, there's always, there's the sugar myths, there's the red
Chocolate.
meat myths, there's all of these different myths. And then it's a low carb, low fat myth.
Right.
So there's different myths. And I hear them so frequently. I say, okay, we really need to investigate these and look at the studies, all the studies, and say, well, where does the evidence lead?
Yeah, I'm going to run through them real quick for our listeners, and then maybe we can pick one or two to dive into a little bit. So, chocolate can help you lose weight. There's sugar silliness. That diet sodas are the answer. That saturated fat is good for you. Coconut oil is a health food. That we're getting too much protein. There's myths about red meat. A myth that organic products are pure, and the non-GMO nonsense.
And then the labeling.
And then the labeling,
If it's on the label, it's good.
that you should avoid all things you don't recognize on a label, basically. So those are the myths you jump into, and lots of good information. So if any of those pique your interest out there, grab a copy of this book, because it's really interesting as he dissects each one of these.
Absolutely.
Did you have one that stood out to you that...
I had a couple. I'm interested in the protein one and the red meat, and then the fat or the label. I don't know. I like them all. Dr. Chaney, do you have one you like, or Kristen, do you have one?
The saturated fat one I thought was a great conversation piece, and that one has been pretty strong out there versus...
Oh gosh, I have people in my circle that are just eating bacon and cheese and, that's all, and meat and just steaks. And there's one in the studio.
Tim's
Hey,
raising
Tim.
his hand.
Oh, wait, we might.
Yes, that would be me.
Let's talk about this because Tim is the man that ate Winston-Salem.
That eats Winston-Salem.
Oh, that eats? Oh, he's eating
Yeah, I
it.
haven't completed eating yet.
Oh, okay. There's still some of the rest of us out there? Okay, Tim. All right, Dr. Chaney.
Okay, so let's talk about that. And it really comes from, part of that's part of that comes from the low carb craze. But the thing is, if you look at the studies, and there are very, very few studies that have looked at this specifically, but when you look at it specifically, saturated fat it increases your risk of heart disease, increases your risk of some kinds of cancer, and it's associated with obesity, a number of other things. But let's kind of go to the low carb phenomenon, because that's, I think, what drives this whole thing. The idea is if you just get rid of carbs, you can eat all the fat you want, and it's going to be healthy for you. And it's fascinating because this gets back to, and this is something that the average person probably can't dissect for themselves, because we're talking about clinical trials here. And remember, I said not every clinical study, every clinical study has its weaknesses, has its flaws. So there was a study that the low carb enthusiasts have used where this was a study which incorporated a number of different clinical trials, or not clinical trials, these were observational studies looking at carbohydrate intake and looking at I think this was looking at longevity, looking at how, whether people died prematurely. And the interesting thing is, if you look at that one, it looks like the lower the carb you go, the healthier you are. Now, here's the interesting thing. You have to look kind of behind that. So this collection of studies, most of the data came from third world countries. And the percent carbohydrate never went below 30%. Now remember, keto is down around 10% or less. So this was a nice straight line. The less carb you ate, down to 30%, the healthier you were, from third world countries. Now you think about it. In a third world country, what does it mean? So the people who are well off, the wealthy ones, can afford the meat, can afford the things that, so they're the ones that are up in the higher levels there. The ones who are dirt poor, what do they live on? Well, maybe the beans and vegetables they can grow. They can't afford meat. They can't afford eggs. They can't afford cheese. They can't afford all of these fatty foods that we're talking about. So yes, they're low carb. They're low carb, but it's not because they're eating a lot of unhealthy fats. So that's the study that the low carb enthusiasts use. There was another study published, and for this study, the data came primarily from the United States, Europe, Japan. These were wealthier countries. So these are countries where people could afford to eat keto. Because keto is expensive. That's a lot of meat.
Yeah.
If you're dirt poor, you can't do that. So now we've got, now it goes all the way down, extrapolates all the way down to 10%. And guess what? When you go below 30%, that it starts to curve up again. And you start to die earlier. So the one that the study of low carb enthusiasts are using to support their argument, again, it's cherry picked. It looks good. But if you actually go down to the low levels of carbohydrate that they're recommending and the kind of high fat diets they're recommending, you have an increased risk of heart attack, an increased risk of death.
But you lose weight.
Illustrates cherry picking, and it illustrates how you can be misled by looking at just one clinical study.
Right.
But you can lose weight, and there's all sorts of companies out there selling you these, ketogenic things.
Well, they know what to say and how to market it, and humans fall for it.
Well, that's actually another really interesting thing, and that's sort of the whole second part of the book where I talk about various diets. But here's the thing that most people don't understand. This will blow your mind in terms of initial weight loss, and in terms of the health parameters that go along with it, like lowering cholesterol, lowering blood sugar, lowering blood pressure. In terms of those things, a vegan diet and a keto diet give you virtually identical results. Now think about it. Those two diets are as much polar opposite as you could get in terms of diets. So you can forget all the mumbo jumbo you've been reading, the metabolic mumbo jumbo about one diet works or not, and say, what do they have in common? They're both very restrictive diets. Here's the secret. Any restrictive diet works short term in terms of weight loss. Any restrictive diet. That's why there's a new fad diet every few months, because sure enough, you restrict calories, you restrict time of eating, you put in a bunch of rules about what you can and can't eat, or you can't eat things together and all those sorts of things. Anytime you have a restrictive diet, you lose weight. But that doesn't mean it's healthy long term.
Say that again for the people in the back.
Yes.
Yes, amen to that. Can you speak a little bit? I remember when, the articles were out, butter is back and Ansel Keys was all wrong. Can you tell me about that controversy about Ansel Keys' research and what was behind all that?
That's so again, that gets back to the kind of thing I was talking to you about previously. So Ansel Keys' research was very well done. It was done in the kind of settings where you can't really duplicate it in today's world. A lot of that was done with people who were incarcerated. You can control their diet exactly. You can't do that anymore. It's not allowed.
Mm-hmm.
But the data he had were very strong. It's when you come along with some of these other data, like the one I shared with you a minute ago, that are misleading, and now people start to question that.
What did Ansel Keys find for those in the audience?
Well, he found that saturated fat raised cholesterol levels.
Okay. All right.
Right. His was the groundbreaking, what we have always gone back to. But people started to question the legitimacy of his research.
Unfortunately, we're coming to kind of a time to break it up. Dr. Chaney is going to be talking to us about his second book. But if you're interested in this conversation, you will love reading this book. He gives you all sorts of things like the 15 secrets I learned along the way. And they're wonderful and they're reasonable. He also has a very good, he goes over those 10 myths, and then he does a really good discussion of the dueling diets that we started to talk about here. So if this has piqued your interest, we hope that you will pick up a copy of his book. And Dr. Chaney, you have some other resources you might like to share with our audience.
Well, I have a website, chaneyhealth.com, but I also do. So I guess I should start. I do a health blog called Health Tips from the Professor. So something new comes out I send it out every Tuesday. So this would be the day. If you're a subscriber, you would have gotten it in your inbox. I think this one is magnesium. Is magnesium good for your heart? Was today's topic.
Good.
Oh, nice.
But it's a different topic every Tuesday.
And you have a repository of those on that website, right? So you can look at some of the
repository on the website. So if you go to the chaneyhealth.com and you click on Health Tips, you can do two things. If you're not currently a subscriber to Health Tips from the Professor, and it's absolutely free, you can subscribe right there and be added to the mailing list. And if you're interested in something, there's a search box there. You can just put the search term into the search box and you'll find some articles I've written in the past on it. Just know that I am not a whiz on search terms, so you might have to use several variations of your search term to actually find it.
Fair enough. And I'm Kristen Norton with Well Balanced Nutrition. Visit us at wellbalancednutrition.com to learn more about us.
And I'm Eleanor Russell at 360healthforyou.com, and we're making healthy happen with you. Have a great day, everybody.
Views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the expressed written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.